Welcome to the Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to be working with functions in ActionScript 3. This is part 3 of that tutorial series. So in this tutorial we're going to build on what we've covered in the first two tutorials on functions and assemble that information in a way that we would see in a real-world application environment. As we said in the previous tutorials, functions are reusable blocks of code that allow us to streamline our application development. The previous two tutorials gave us the basic configuration of a function statement. Now let's take that information and use it in a way that we may find ourselves using functions as we develop our Flash applications. We covered two different types of functions thus far: functions that return values and functions that do not return values. Both types of functions are very important to understanding ActionScript 3 programming. Most times, we will use functions that do not return values. They are much more common in programming. As we discussed earlier, you will rely heavily on functions as we work through our remaining tutorials and also as you develop your own applications. Let's say, for example, that there are numerous places throughout our code where we would like to have a count up to 15, or any number for that matter. We could use the following example to accomplish that function. And here we just got a regular function. We're declaring a variable number 3, and then we're using our function to actually go through and count up. And you'll notice we're calling that function numerous times, not just once, and you're going to see that when we go through our demonstrations, that you can call a function numerous times throughout your application. Function can also return values that are very useful as we develop our application. Remember, when we return a value in a function, we need to declare the data type of the return. We also need to use the return keyword followed by the name of the data being returned. So let's look at some examples of a function in ActionScript that returns values. So we're going to go ahead and move into our development environment. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and minimize our presentation. Let's go ahead and open up Flash in our development environment. You'll notice I got our branding layer loaded. So let's dive deeper into our discussion on functions. The first thing I want to do is I want to add a layer to our timeline. And I'm going to name the layer Actions. And I'm going to go ahead and lock that Actions layer. So I want to select frame 1 of my Actions layer. Let's open up our Actions panel, F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Mac. And let's enter some code. So I'm going to enter my stop statement. And then I'm going to enter a function. This is going to be our count up, opening and closing parentheses. I'm going to put in my void since we're not expecting a return. My opening and closing curly braces, put in a for loop, and then I'm going to declare a variable. We do this quite often in a for loop, and again, we'll start going through these for loops in a future tutorial. But I'm going to declare a variable I, and it's going to be a UINT data type, and I'm going to give that a value of 1, put in my semicolon. And I'm going to say if I is less than or equal to 5, put in my semicolon, and then I'm going to take I and I'm going to add 1 to it. And we've done this before in a previous tutorial. Then I'm going to have my opening and closing curly braces inside the for loop. And I'm just going to say trace I. So I'm going to trace out I to the output panel and end that with a semicolon. And what I want to do here is I want to show you that we can actually call this multiple times. So I'm going to come down here, let's do a save. Let's save this. By the way, I'm saving this as our flash _1007 _1. This is our first example in this tutorial. I'm going to call up my function. Let's make sure we can spell it correctly. So count up with my parentheses. Let's go ahead and save that change. If we test this in our browser window, we'll see that it counts 1 to 5. It's actually walked through our for loop, and it's traces each time. So what we're doing is we're assigning a variable I with the UINT data type, and we're saying you're equal to 1. And if I is less than or equal to 5, and the unique thing with for loops is it makes this evaluation the first time through. And then with a for loop, and we'll get into this when we get into the for loop tutorials, it actually executes this code, then runs this code in the curly braces, then goes back and looks for this again, runs the code in the curly braces until this evaluates to not true. So as long as this is true, It's going to run through the code in the curly braces, come up here and run this, and then go right back and run that evaluation again. And you'll notice it gave us a count up to number 5. It traced out 1 through 5 through that particular function. And I could call this numerous times. Having a real problem today spelling count. And every time I call this in my code, it's going to execute this function. Let's go ahead and save that change. Now let's go ahead and refresh or test our movie. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. And you'll notice now we've actually run the code inside that function 3 separate times because we actually called the function 3 separate times. So let's go ahead and save those changes. Notice the output panel displays the 3 calls to the function. I demonstrated this so that it's very clear that a function can be called numerous times as we execute our code. You're not limited to calling it just one time. Notice that we followed the format of our proper function. We set the function up as we've gone through in the first 2 tutorials, and then in order to execute the function, we actually call it inside of our ActionScript. We declared the function using the function keyword. We named our function CountUp. We used parentheses to hold any parameters that it may have been passed. In this case, there were none. We didn't pass any parameters into our function. That's why our parentheses are empty. And then using the for loop, we stepped through the for loop as long as I was less than or equal to 5. Then we incremented I, and that's what this I++ is doing. It's just incrementing the value of I, so each time it goes through it's one additional value. So the first time it's 1, the second time it's 2, the third time it's 3, and that's why you're seeing this count up as going from 1 to 5, because we said less than or equal to 5. Finally, we trace the value of the I out into the output panel. Notice that we have a for loop statement running inside of our function. As we move forward in the tutorials, you'll see this many times, that we've predefined function methods running inside of other function methods. We can actually have functions inside of functions. This is called nesting or nested functions. And again, we'll go through that as we start working through some of the future tutorials. And then we came down here, we called our function 3 times to the output panel. What if we wanted that iterations to be 10 or 7? All we'd have to do to accomplish that is change the value of this value. If I wanted it to be 10, I just change the value of I is less than or equal to 10. If we save that change and we execute this, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac, now we're talking or counting from 1 to 10. So it's just a matter of changing what the value is inside of our evaluation. And that's what we're doing now. We're actually evaluating the value of I. So we could make this go to whatever we really needed it to go to. And there's a lot of reasons why you use counters inside of ActionScript and inside of any programming language, as you'll see as we move on. All right, let's get into another demonstration. Okay, so let's take it another step further. I want you to get used to using variables. So I'm going to go right up here under stop and declare a variable. And this variable is going to be called, let's call it num. And it's going to be data typed as a number. And I want that to be equal to 3. And now what I want to do, we can actually come down here using the same countup function, and instead of evaluating the value of I against a fixed value, I'm just going to make I equal, or I is less than or equal to num. So what I'm doing is I'm actually taking the value of our variable, and you'll see this quite often inside a function, and actually inside of most of our programming inside of ActionScript, and again inside most other programming languages. Let's go ahead and do a save as on this. Let's save this as number 2. So now what we're doing is we're evaluating I against whatever the value of our num variable is. So again, I'm going to go ahead and do a Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac to test this, and you'll see now we're counting up to number 3. And all I'd have to do to modify this function or to modify this count is to change the value of the num variable. I'm going to go ahead and change that to 10. When I test the movie, you'll see now that we're counting up to 10. It's very, very common to use variables inside of these so that we can actually have this much more dynamic. Notice the output panel now displays our count all the way to 10. Variables play an important role in the development of our code as we do functions. So it's very important that you not only understand how the functions operate, but also how variables operate inside your programming language. It's important as you work through the tutorials to bring together the different aspects of the programming language and build upon what we've learned. And that's why I'm trying to use these variables inside of our functions. Again, I want to build upon what you're learning step by step as we learn this programming language. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of the Flash development environment for a minute. Let's go back into our presentation, because there's one other thing I want to stress while we're wrapping up the tutorials on functions. One other thing that I want to stress in this wrap-up of function is the scope of variables. Many new programmers get frustrated by not understanding that variables are only accessible within the scope in which they're declared. What does that mean? If a variable is declared within a function, it has its own scope inside the function. But once the progression of the code moves outside the function, that variable is no longer accessible. And it's very important that you understand that. So let's go back into the development environment and work through a couple exercises that show you and demonstrate the different scopes of variables inside of ActionScript. All right, so I'm going to drop out of our presentation. Let's get back into our Flash development environment. And let's comment out this code, because I don't want this to execute anymore. We're going to do a different demonstration. And what I want to do now is let's go ahead and make sure we're on frame 1 of the actions layer, which we are. And let's write a new set of code. So the first thing I want to do, I want to declare a variable. And I want this variable to be called first name, because we're actually going to work with something other than numbers. We work with numbers quite a bit. I need you to realize that there's a lot of other things we can do with variables. And I want this to equal a string. So I'm going to have the first name equal John. I'm going to end that with a semicolon. Then I'm going to come down below it, declare another variable called last name. And I want to declare that as a string. So it's going to be a string variable, and I want that to equal Smith. So now I've got two variables, first and last name, and I've got values for both those variables. Now I want to create a function. And this function I want to call getName. I'm going to have my opening and closing parentheses. I'm going to have a data type of void, opening curly brace and closing curly brace. Actually, you know what? No, I take this back. I want this data type to be string, because I'm actually going to return a string value from this function. And now what I want to do is I want to create a variable inside the function called full name. And that's going to be data typed as a string. And I want that to be equal to first name plus the plus sign, and we're using that as a concatenation symbol. What concatenation symbols do is they join together strings inside of programming. I'm going to have a quotation mark, a space, and a quotation mark, then another concatenation symbol. In other words, I'm going to join together another variable, and I'm going to bring in last name. These have to be spelled exactly as they appear in the variable names. And then I want my return to be full name. So I'm actually going to return that value, full name, that I'm getting from that function. And I want to come down below my curly braces, and I'm going to have a variable called username. I want to data type that as a string, and that is going to be equal to getName. So I'm calling the function, opening and closing parentheses, and then trace inside my parentheses username. And we've gone through this so many times, you should have a pretty good handle as to what this is actually doing. Now would be a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as on this panel. I'm going to go ahead and save this as _3 in our work files. And now what I want to do is I want to test this movie. And if everything is working correctly, the function is going to pull the value of first name, it's going to pull the value of last name, it's going to join those together, and it's going to give us a return of full name, because we actually assigned the variable full name to that string. In other words, to the variables, to the values of those two variables, first and last name. And then we're coming down here and I'm creating a variable called username. I'm data typing it as a string, and I'm telling it run the function getName. So it's going to run that function getName, pull the value out, the return value full name, and it's going to assign that to the username variable, because we're having it return full name inside the function. And then I'm going to trace the username to our output panel. So let's do a control enter in Windows and a command return in the Mac. And you'll notice now in our output panel we have John Smith. And the reason we have the space is because we put that space right there. That's why there's a space between the first and last name. If I were to take this out, let's go ahead and do that. And I'll show you why we put the space there. Let's go ahead and save that change and test the movie again. they'd all just run together. So if I want to add spaces into my string variables, I have to use the concatenation symbol, which is the plus sign in ActionScript. I put a quotation mark, space, and a quotation mark, and then another plus sign to add the other variable to that string. Save that change, test it in our browser, Control Alt Windows, Command Return in the Mac, test the movie, I should say, and it's John Smith. All I would have to do to update this is to change any one of these variables. By changing the variables, I change the outcome from the function. Save the change, test the movie, and now it's Peter Johnson. Because this function's taking those two string values and putting those together inside the function and then returning the full name to us, which we're using as a username. So notice the output panel now displays the name of the user that the function put together for us. If we change the variables, it's actually going to change the return of the function because the function is using these variables, which are globally scoped, creating a variable inside the function, which is locally scoped, and then returning that variable outside the function so we can use it to set up our username. If we were to attach these variables to input text fields, as we will do in future tutorials on the stage, the user could log in and we could pass that information to the function to perform a welcome message. So let's go on and we'll actually do another demonstration of this. All right, so we're going to keep this same group of code, but I want to make a few modifications to it. Just going to we'll leave it at Peter Johnson, that's good. But I want to go in down here to my welcome, or to my trace statement, and let me show you how we can add to the trace statement. So what I'm doing is I'm typing welcome to the website inside quotation marks, and then I'm using that concatenation symbol to add the username to it. So now I'm taking that username and adding it to an existing sentence. Let's go ahead and do a save as. Let's save this as our work file 4. So when I test this movie now, it should be able to take those variables, the values from the two variables, the function will add them or concatenate them together into my full name string. The full name will be returned outside the function to this username because we're calling that function. And then my trace statement will be welcome to the website. Actually, let's put a space here. In fact, I'm going to put a space and a comma. Welcome to the website. And then it will give whatever username we have in those variables. So if I test this movie, Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac, you'll see now we have welcome to the website and then Peter Johnson. Of course, I don't have my spacing correctly. I should have the space there and remove that space. Save the change and test it. And now we have welcome to the website, Peter Johnson. It's actually taking the values from the variables. The function puts those values together, and then we're traced out into our output panel with our welcome message. So now you'll notice in the output panel we see the value of the variable tied to a statement that we typed in the trace statement. That plus sign that we used in the last two examples is a concatenation sign that joins groups of text, variables, or combinations thereof together. We use a concatenation sign quite a bit in all different programming languages. ActionScript, that happens to be a plus sign. In PHP, it's a dot or a period. I mean, every language has some of their own unique idiosyncrasies. But for ActionScript 3, you want to remember that the plus sign is the one that actually joins groups together. You'll see us use this many times throughout the tutorial series. We're going to be using concatenation and we're going to be using a lot of functions, a lot, as we go through the tutorials. Keep in mind that what we're displaying in the trace statement, as we will do in the future tutorials, could also be linked to a dynamic text field. So we could actually take this statement and instead of tracing it to the output panel, which is what we're doing now, because we don't have anything on our stage, we could actually be writing that to a text box on our stage, as we'll do in future tutorials. So again, I want you to understand the only reason we're using the output panel and the trace statement so often is because right now we haven't got into designing anything yet on our stage, but that's coming. The first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and comment this out, because we're going to write a new piece of code here to do this demonstration. And I want to create a function called variable. Open and close parentheses. I'm going to data type this as void since I expect no return, and then my opening and closing curly braces. And inside the function, I want to create a variable called myTest. I'm going to data type that as a number, and I want that to be equal to 5. And then outside the function, let me go ahead and scroll up a little bit. I want to call the function itself, so I'm going to call variable, open and close parentheses, and then I want to trace the myTest variable. And I'm going to end that with a semicolon. And I want you to think about what we just typed. Go ahead and pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. I'm going to go ahead and save this as my work 5. Now what I want to do is I want to test this movie, but I want you to think about what we've just done. And I want you to think about whether or not we're going to see that variable that we're tracing in the output panel. So I'm going to go ahead and test the movie. And you'll notice we don't see the number 5 in our output panel, and we've actually generated an error. It's telling us that we have access of an undefined property, myTest. So notice there's no output in the output panel on the variable that we traced. In fact, if you look at the compiler, you'll notice that it tells us that that doesn't exist. An undefined property means it does not exist. The application cannot find the variable that we're trying to trace. And the reason being is because this variable is scoped only to be available inside this function. If I were to add a trace statement right below this and trace myTest, and then remove this trace statement, because I don't want to generate an error, I want the code to actually execute. I still need to call the function, but now I'm tracing it inside the function. Let's go ahead and save that change, test our movie, and you'll notice now we see the value 5. And the reason being is because the scope of the variable that we created, let me go ahead and minimize this so you can actually see these panels together. The reason being is the scope of that variable that we created is only available inside that function. It's so important that you understand the scope of variables. If I want to see this value, I've got to return it so that it's available outside the function. So let me show you how we can do that, how we can return that value so it's available outside the function. Right below where I trace myTest, I'm going to type return, and I'm going to say myTest. I also want to change the data type. Since our function now is actually returning a value, I want to change this to number because it's going to be returning a number value. So I want to call that function, but what I want to do is I want to call the function this way. I'm going to create a variable, and we'll call it num1, and that's going to be equal, first we're going to data type that as a number, because we know the value that we're returning is a number. It's going to be equal to calling the function, so it's going to equal the return of that function. And then I'm going to come down here and trace num1. So now I should be able to see the value of the function, and I should also see the trace statement inside the function, because now those values are available in both places. Let's go ahead and save that change, test our movie, and you'll notice now in the output panel we're seeing both the 5 from inside the function, right there. That's our first 5 from our first trace statement. This is the second trace statement where we've actually assigned num1 the value of the variable function. So of that function that we created, by the way, I just use variable as a name. It could be anything. This could be any name. I could call this test if I wanted to. In fact, we'll change it because I don't want you to be confused thinking it has to be a variable. It's not. We'll just call it test1. Change it here to test1. It'll have no impact, whatever the value of that name is. Save that change and test it. And again, you're seeing that we're seeing both our values inside our output panel. So it's very important that you understand the scope of how variables work inside of ActionScript. If we declare a variable inside a function, it is only scoped and available in that function unless we return it to something outside the function, like we did here. We actually returned it to num1. So it's very, very important. We're going to discuss more about this as we go through future tutorials. We're going to practice this over and over again as we're working with other functions, and I will reiterate the scope of functions. But again, I just want you to have a good grasp of how functions work in ActionScript, because they are probably one of the most used items in the programming language. Between functions and variables, you'll use those more than you're going to use anything else as you learn this programming language. All right, so let's drop out of our development environment, go back into our presentation to review what we've covered in this tutorial. So let's review what we talked about in part 3 of functions in ActionScript 3. Again, we use the function keyword to declare our function. We use the trace statement both inside of a function and outside of a function, so you can demonstrate how you can actually pull those values into the output panel if you want to test your code. We looked at multiple function calls at the very beginning of the tutorial. We actually called that countup function multiple times, so you can see that, again, demonstrating that you're not limited to calling a function once. You can call it hundreds of times inside your application. We looked at our variable statement again, and we use variables both inside and outside our functions. We looked at unit data type, UINT, and we looked at a less than and equal to operators inside of ActionScript 3. We looked at the plus and how we can increment a variable inside a for loop and add 1 to it, to the value. We looked at the string data type, and we use the string data type inside of our function to actually join together strings. Again, we looked at the return keyword inside of a function and how we can return a value from within inside of our functions to outside the function. We talked about the concatenation sign, that plus sign, and again, you'll get very, very used to using that as we work through these tutorials because we use concatenation quite a bit. And we concatenated variables to text inside of our function. We looked at local variables, and we talked about the scope of variables both inside functions and outside functions. In the next tutorial, we're going to start our adventure with using events in ActionScript 3, both mouse and keyboard events. And now's where we're actually going to start working with the stage itself, adding things to the stage and writing ActionScript to interact with items on the stage.